Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of a technical glitch here. This is a new system for us here at Forward Thinking EDU. Today, our webinar is entitled Looking Back to Get Ahead, Strategies for Prioritizing and Maximizing Your EdTech Initiatives. I'm going to go to the next slide. Thank you to our sponsors, Gray Ed Solutions and Cell Phone Repair here in Illinois. This is part of our 2018 What Works series. Just a little bit about our sponsors, Gray Ed Solution. They're really about transforming teaching and learning by bringing educators and business practices together to improve learning. Connecting the classroom to EdTech products and development is so important these days, and really that's what they do at Gray Ed Solutions. And then, also they help schools build a stronger foundation for technology use. With the amount of technology budgets that are being spent these days, Gray Ed Solutions really helps schools and school districts efficiently spend that money there. And then finally, they're offering technology planning and implementation strategies, coaching and mentoring and professional development for your administrators and for your teachers. Our other sponsor this time is Cell Phone Repair. So thank you to them. Cell Phone Repair provides schools and school districts repairing and improving your digital devices. They help with network management, help desk services, and data recovery. And if you'd like to contact them, feel free to call them at area code 309-256-0997. That is in the Chicagoland area. They would be happy to talk to you more about how they can help you manage your devices more efficiently and effectively for your school or school district. Next slide. So today's presenter, we're happy to have Dr. Julie Carter here. She's the CEO and co-founder of Gray Ed Solutions. And not only is she an entrepreneur, but she is a former executive director of technology at the Minnetonka Public Schools. And if you've gone to any frequent EdTech conferences or technology conferences, instructional design or instructional technology, you've probably seen Julie at one of those conferences. This past year, she was named one of the most influential EdTech folks in the country. So we're really happy to have Julie here today with us. So I'll turn it over to Julie, and then feel free to add some of your questions in the chat box, and we will try to answer those at the end of the presentation. So Julie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. It is really delightful to be here to talk about a topic that is so interesting to me. When you heard Michael talk a little bit about the background of Gray Ed Solutions and what we do, this whole idea of maximizing and strategizing and really helping organizations is at the heart of what we do. So when this opportunity came forward to have a chance to show and share a little bit with you today, I was so excited to be able to do this. So thank you for participating and being a part of this event today. And a big thank you to Forward Thinking EDU for sponsoring this, along with CPR as well. So my focus today is really to spend time with this idea of how to maximize the EdTech initiatives happening in your organization. We are all so focused on doing initiatives and different types of initiatives across different levels in the organization. And this idea of really stopping and looking behind in order to think through and plan for where you're going, and just this concept almost of the GPS, where you have to know where you're starting from in order to know where it is you're going. And just pausing and taking that opportunity to look at what's happened in order to plan for what's ahead is really what we're going to talk about today. And certainly the new year is a really perfect time for this as we think about the types of conversations that we're having just in our own lives as 2018 rolled around and we're kind of reflecting on what's happened in the past year. It's the perfect opportunity to do the same as we look at the successes that have happened or shortcomings that have happened and lessons learned so far this calendar year in the school system. Certainly this time of year is really key for our ed leaders who are faced with making decisions for the 18-19 school year. We're already into budget planning. We're having conversations with districts about professional development for next year and tying it to their initiatives. So it's really an ideal time to stop and reflect and think about the school year to date and the types of things that we've learned and what we can do to kind of prepare and look ahead. So that's really what we're going to focus on today. And when I talk to school districts, I really like to think about this process as sort of a well check. We think about, many of us will have sort of a well check every year, making sure things are going well. Apologies on the slides. I think it's auto advancing on a couple of these. So sorry about that if you're wondering what I'm doing on this end. That idea of the organizational well check is to diagnose what's working well and really to understand what changes need to be made. So this whole idea of looking back to get ahead, it's this idea of taking this kind of temperature check on the overall health of the organization and really understanding what's working, where we may need to dedicate some time and focus. So think about that as sort of a picture as I'm talking about this. It's this idea of the well check. And my hope is that we're bringing you some strategies today to make this easier. And so it's almost as easy as 1, 2, 3. We've got 4 categories or buckets that we're kind of breaking this into as we look at that well check and how do we even get started. So the 4 areas we're going to talk about today begins with, well, how do you even understand what it is you have and what is it that you want to keep? And then we're going to transition from that piece to really looking at where are the stakeholders' voice within this well check opportunity to look at what's happening in your organization. So not just from your perspective as the leader, but what are we learning and understanding from others? And then we'll transition into the initiatives and the prioritization and what are we learning as a result of this? And finally, we'll wrap up today with really talking about how do we do more with what it is we already have. So that's just kind of a little roadmap, what I intend to walk through today as an opportunity to really kind of chunk these into buckets. And this very first one is this whole idea of understanding what it is you have and what is it that you're actually using. As we talk about looking forward to budgets and planning for next year, this is an opportune time to really look at what's the software and subscriptions that you're subscribing to as an organization, and how do I actually understand what the return on investment is, what's my bang for the buck as I look at what's actually being used, what's really making a difference inside my organization. And so this is a key piece that we talk with districts about a lot, is trying to understand how do we get our arms around this and how is it that we get an idea of the different pieces that we already own and where are we having success and where are we struggling. So for those of you that have already been through this type of a process, I just want you to reflect for a minute and think about what are some of the challenges that are a part of that process. If somebody were to come into your office and ask, explain to me what your top 5 most used pieces of software for instruction are, or insert, whatever piece that you're looking for data on. How easy is it for you to get your hands around that? What are the measures that you're looking at that actually equate to success? Are we just looking at usage and usage in terms of dollars spent? Are we making any ties to instructional impact? So there's a lot of components that go with this. And when I talk to districts, the piece that people seem to really struggle with here is that it's a very daunting task. It's overwhelming because of the myriad of different types of software program subscriptions and freeware that people are using. In a lot of cases, there's just so many moving pieces, and we're not even sure sometimes where the information lives for each of these systems. And for a number of them, you may need to do some coordinating with the solution provider to actually get access to the information, and extremely time consuming. So on the flip side of this, as you think about your purchasing cycles, when you are making new adoptions and implementations, something to keep in mind is making sure that you're able to see this information and that you know what it is you'd be looking for, whether it's just usage statistics or correlated information, so you could see not just usage, but at the class level or the campus level, some things to keep in mind as you're thinking about it. So as we've worked with districts on trying to kind of look at this piece, part of the reason we talk about this is that oftentimes we add and add and add to the plate in education, and we rarely take off. And we see this very frequently in this mode of buying different kinds of software and services and subscriptions, which are fantastic resources many times to really aid classroom instruction, but we don't necessarily go back to see what it is that's continuing to be used and the impact that it's making. So we think it's really important to call this piece out and give you an opportunity to really focus on this, because if you are able to remove some of those pieces, you're able to free up budget resources, perhaps to allocate elsewhere, depending on how your budget is structured, or to really see if there is a piece of software or a subscription to something where your usage is really low and you intend to believe there's a correlation that professional development hasn't accompanied. Or if you're really seeing an encouraged number and high usage and you want to hone in and make sure you're toning your professional development towards it, really, really great opportunity. So this is really kind of a multifaceted step in that there's a lot of learning that comes from this. When we talk about the challenging pieces of it, the kind of stellar tools and processes, what's the best thing out there to be able to do this? Because it really is a daunting task. So something that we've heard a lot of conversation about, and we really follow CETA closely and the companies that they work with, that the state education technology directors have an opportunity to really voice input on and really look at these things. And one of CETA's organizations that they were working with this year is the Learn platform. And it's one idea for you as you're thinking about things that can correlate usage with cost and just getting that sense of what's being used in my district. How does that break down to a per student level when I'm looking at return on investment? So it's a tool to be thinking about. When we look at this, this is just one piece of that picture or puzzle, because we want to be very conscientious that the usage information and cost information, while extremely valuable, needs that next layer of really the context around why people are or are not using it, and that flavor from teachers and students of what's actually happening. So it's a perfect segue into the next bucket that we're looking at, is really understanding from your stakeholders their experience within the organization. As you're thinking through EdTech, planning for new innovations, new rollouts, focusing on professional development, tying it to other district initiatives, the really essential need to understand from each of the stakeholders where they're at and what their challenges have been is such an essential piece. And so I really see this as a hand in hand with that previous idea, understanding what you have, what you're using, where can you really shift that? And now let's find out, not just looking at the data on the back end, but talking to the people on the front end. So really important to understand their experience from the front lines, the things that are happening. And as we work with organizations, we oftentimes go in and sit down to really have these conversations, really look at what's going on, because the best thing we can do is to gain that buy-in and trust from stakeholders. And so as an ed leader in your organization, thinking through what are ways that I can get that buy-in and trust, how do I really establish a pulse point on what's currently happening? That idea of really needing to understand where am I today in order to understand where I want to be tomorrow and next year. So this idea of inventorying my stakeholders and really getting a pulse point from them is something we talk very frequently about with districts, especially in this idea of perceived gaps, confirmation of things that we suspect to be true based on what we're observing, but we really don't have something to point to correlate this information, and just to find some ahas within the organization itself. So one of the things that we have done as an organization is work really closely with our school districts, leverage our background as current and former EdTech administrators in our roles as CTOs and CIOs, and really looked at what are the things I need to know and understand about my organization to feel like I have a pulse point on the EdTech community in my organization. And part of what's so challenging as leaders when we think about how do we answer a question like, how is it going with technology in my organization? You can't separate one individual strand of technology out. It's really about finding it intermixed and woven into all of these other areas that live within the ecosystem itself. So it's a really interesting challenge in order to try to comb through that. So as an organization, what we ended up doing was identifying key frameworks, key learning standards, EdTech organizations that groups really looked at to know and tailor their experiences after, and come up with a series of questions to ask your key stakeholders in order to identify and get that pulse point. So looking at those types of questions and going out to talk to your principals, your teachers, your business office, your clerical workers, and folks from all different stakeholder roles that interact with technology in some fashion every day in their job, and thinking through the types of things to ask them to understand how is technology working in the environment as it relates to key areas that I'd like to go over with you. And what we did as an organization is think about that practice of actually asking questions to a group of people and feeling like I'm taking a survey and I'm asked to rate myself or rate my organization. And we spent quite a bit of time researching this process and found this really interesting body of research around semantic distance. And this idea of using word pairs in an inventory to ask users to pick an adjective that most closely relates to their feelings on what's happening in the environment. And what we discovered was this really amazing kind of true reflection on the pulse point of what's happening. When I'm asked and shown two adjectives and I'm picking and sliding my slider towards the one that best describes what's happening, I get a great reaction, and then I'm able to look at that and correlate that to all of the other roles and individuals within my organization. So when I talked a little bit earlier about really working with our schools and our districts and leveraging some of these other frameworks, we were very lucky to have an opportunity to sit down with the National School Board Association 20 to Watch educators at the COSIN conference. And one of the things we did was really have a conversation around this idea of understanding what's happening inside your EdTech ecosystem. How can I look at, diagnose, analyze, and this whole idea of looking back to get ahead? And what we did was really walk them through this process of the idea of inventorying the stakeholders, using this semantic distance notion to really resonate and actually adapt what we're asking them based on who they are. So if I'm a principal, I have a certain set of questions I'm responding to. If I am a clerical worker, I have a different set of questions I'm responding to. Of course, aligned and tagged to the things that most represent my daily job within the organization. And one of the really key pieces of information we walked away from with that group was the need to align to these leading frameworks. Because one of the challenges that we all have is that there are so many different initiatives and pieces and frameworks and standards. We don't want to get lost in the shuffle of thinking about how do we do this, and is this yet another new set of conversations I need to be having with my staff, and how do I explain this to them? So what we did was take all of these questions and correlate them to the frameworks you see on the screen, with the idea that these are really what drive your perspective on what's happening. And if I'm an organization that has really used ISTE with my teachers, my students, my admin, to really kind of help tailor my vision and understanding, I can look at it through that lens. Or if I've really done Future Ready and followed that work with my administrative team, it's a perfect tie-in to look at it through that lens. So just a great way to be able to leverage what's out there and recognize the great things that are happening. So the work that we've been doing is really around that idea of what are the things I want to know, developing a very key set of questions aligned to the leading frameworks and set to be adapted to the stakeholders within my organization in order to find out how are you feeling and how is this going and where are those gaps, disconnects. So really, this is the context that we're giving the other kinds of data that we have in our organization. And we're measuring for the first time things that previously were fairly intangible around attitudes, around different types of competencies. It's a really great way to get that slice of information that I haven't had access to before. And this really goes hand in hand with bucket number 3, which is about prioritizing your focus. Because if I collect all of this information about what's happening in my organization, now how do I actually begin to look at that information, digest that information, and act on it? Because I'm going to have a barrage of things when I set out to understand what's happening. I'm going to have a lot of information. So how do I prioritize it, focus it, and really ultimately learn from that? So what we've done again is expand this concept of being able to take in this vast amount of information from all of these different stakeholder groups, aligned to all of these different frameworks, and actually present it in a way where those questions get answered for you. So I talked earlier about the 6 kind of key areas of focus for this, where we're really looking at what are the pieces that we need to understand about our organization. That idea that I can't just pull technology aside and just look at technology and give it its own standalone rating. Technology is embedded in all of these strands and what's happening. And what we've done is identify these 6 buckets, beginning with leadership and vision in the upper left, and incorporating tech infrastructure, which is only one slice. And oftentimes when we talk about really assessing or auditing, it really becomes focused on devices and infrastructure, and it's just one tiny piece of the puzzle. And then we move on to look at resources. And what we believe as an organization is that through our experience, both as administrators, but also working with other districts, we see those first 3 across the top arch are the foundational components that really make or break learner impact in the end. So leadership and vision, technology infrastructure, and resources are really that base foundation that when that foundation is in place, the leadership and vision is present, the infrastructure is there to support, The resources are layered in, which doesn't just mean budget, it also means human capacity. That's when we really begin to see growth and success in an organization, because instruction and learning and practice and implementation, as important and wonderful as they are, that's where we oftentimes see pockets of success rather than systemic change within an organization. And when we look and analyze at the data coming in from this inventory, what we find is when we're weak in one of those foundational elements, that's when we struggle and have this pocket non-systemic focus on what's happening in the organization. So this kind of grounds the conversation a little bit in terms of thinking of these 6 areas as what we're looking at. And what we tried to do to really assist districts is saying, at the completion of my inventory, where my stakeholders are responding to these questions that have been put out before them, I'm presented with a dashboard where all of the things I should know as a result are there for me. And what that means is that I look at an overall capacity for each of those 6 areas that we identified. What's working well? At a glance, I can tell where my pain points might be. If I note that I'm really low in technology infrastructure, for example, that's my key to dive in and get a little bit more information. So what this looks like, you'll notice on the screen here, this is a pretty wide screen capture showing you the dashboard and all of the different information you're presented with at that district broad level. But if I were to zoom in, and if infrastructure, for example, was a low area for me and I really needed to spend some focal time on that, what I learn is the areas inside of infrastructure and their key areas that really need additional work, whether it's my bandwidth and Wi-Fi, whether it's my access to devices. And what I'm presented with is the opportunity to look at and analyze this information within different data slices. So here I happen to be looking at this information by stakeholder. So I can drill in to see, well, how did my teachers respond to this versus my district administrators? How did my IT staff fare versus my instructional support? And it's fascinating to be able to slice and look at this information this way. And the example you see here, I can tell at a glance, my IT staff is ranking much higher in all of the capacity areas as the responses come in. And right away, I can see I've got a bit of a disconnect, and whether it's things happening at that level that aren't making it out to the rest of the staff, or there's some communication missing there, or I'm not getting that feedback from my users that informs me from IT that perhaps things aren't exactly where I think they need to be. So in addition to being able to slice that information and understand more about what's happening, I've got a series of questions for me to use as I look at the data. So right above every graph, you're going to find that opportunity to really drill in and say, here's the questions you should be asking as you're looking at this. So as your leadership team sits down, let's think about these things, talk about these so that you can begin to draw conclusions and take action based on what it is you see. So stakeholder is just one way to look at this. I can continue to look at this data by campus, by level. If I'm curious about how my middle school is faring versus my high school or elementary, especially pre or post an implementation or an adoption, this is a whole new world for me as an ed leader, as I have the chance to understand and wrap my arms around the stakeholder perspective in my organization. And it's the type of information that I can use, again, to really say, am I correct about some of the assumptions I'm making? Or are there gaps that I wasn't aware of? Are there perceived conflicts that we should be addressing? And how do I use this to drive my planning process? One of my favorite ways to look at this is by department, which you see on the screen now. And that's the idea that in addition to being able to slice by those other areas, maybe I want to look at this by department or concentration in which people work If I'm specifically looking at my teachers, I may want to understand how science, math, ELA, and the different content areas respond. Again, especially if I'm looking to do particular work in one of these areas and I'm looking for a group that might be ready to take on a different type of initiative that I have coming out, or I'm looking for a group that I need to focus some time and effort on with professional development. Just a rich set of data to be able to drill in and look at. So very exciting as we think about the power and potential of continuing this type of work with schools, where getting your arms around this type of information is presented to you in a fairly easy fashion to understand and digest, and then looking very specifically at each one of your areas of growth. And what you're seeing on the screen is just a quick clip around our action planning template. So baked right into the dashboard is the opportunity to say, here are the areas of concentration and focus for you based on these organizational scores. Here's your personal profile of what that means. And now here are some planning areas for you and your team to discuss further, because part of what's so essential is that you have conversation when you look at your data in whatever form you're gathering it and whatever questions you're coming in and collecting about your stakeholders. You have to really decide, is the information that's being presented to you, does it resonate? Is this confirming something that you already know to be true? Based on what you've learned, is this a priority area of focus for you? And based on that, then you can begin to build the work around it. You see there's a section to the far right that's all about artifact and evidence upload. So as you do find those areas of priority and focus, because the bucket that we're looking at right now is this bucket of how do I prioritize and focus? So something like this, as you begin to look at the data, is pointing out and developing that roadmap for you and saying, here are the areas that we're recommending you focus on. Now, with your lens, pair this up against the initiatives that you're working on, the things that you know to be true about your environment, and really look at which one of these makes sense to move forward. And now here are some specific action steps for you to take in order to help you move the needle forward in your organization. Because really, that's the whole idea of this, documenting, baselining where you are today in order to grow and show over time your maturity within the organization. One of the best conversations we have with districts are districts who are in these conversations, whether it's districts going out for referendum, districts who have just done an adoption, and what they're looking for is context to the story around what's happened in the organization after something has come in and had this kind of change. And this type of idea gives you the pre and post look at the story around what's happened, the context and the reaction and responses from your stakeholders in those key areas of leadership, infrastructure, resources, practice and implementation, and all around that circle of really focusing, getting to the heart of learner impact, which is what we're all in this business for. So the fourth bucket that we're really focusing on in this whole idea of the well check is do more with what you have. And this is just that whole idea of less is more. And there are so many wonderful things we get excited about and bring in and try out in our organization. And part of the time, what we see is after year one, support drops. It's on to kind of the next piece, the next new initiative, and things don't continue to be supported. And I really see this in the lens of professional development, where maybe year one is where the professional development comes with something new that you're bringing into the organization, whether it's something new for an instructional practice or something new for a tool or a software, that's where we see the focus is on year one. So this whole idea of do more with what you have is looking at, let's think about the things that you do already have. And before we continue to add to it, let's make sure we're maximizing and doing what we can with what we already have. And this whole idea really is what begs innovation. And one of my favorite quotes, and we just saw this in George Kouros's newsletter recently, is this whole idea of pivoting to innovation, and the idea that schools need to shift away from the idea of EdTech to focus on innovation. And I think he's so right on when he talks about that this difference and this shift is because it's not about the stuff, it's about the learner. And this really resonates with us because when we look at identifying those key areas of focus, and I talked about how infrastructure is just one piece of it, again, it's that feeling that it tends to be devices and access that people really focus their energy on in these conversations about how is it going, what's happening in our organization, what are we doing in our organization where technology is really impacting the classroom. It becomes about the stuff. So really pivoting to innovation and looking at doing more with what you already have. And I feel like several years ago, the focus of this conversation was really on frameworks and the type of frameworks that allowed us as leaders to help teachers understand how to move through those stages of integration. There was so much great conversation around, the RAP model is what I first used years ago in EdTech. SAMR, is so well known to so many of us that has been through many iterations, the pool being one of my favorite, TPAC, but all of these great frameworks that really allowed a conversation starter in our organization. For some of us, it was the first time we can begin to talk to people about how to use technology in the classroom, what it meant to really move through those phases. And if you really think about, the right-hand end or the top of the pyramid in any of these, the ultimate goal was really to get to what we would call innovation. We're using it in new and different ways. We're transforming what's happening. So I think these frameworks have some relevancy in the sense that for many of us, this allowed us to have common language with our schools. This allowed us to have conversations that weren't happening previously. It put a picture and gave context to teachers on how to move. But what we want to be careful of is that we don't just stop here. For many of us, the models that we see here continue to remain somewhat device-centric and more focused on the stuff, and needing to kind of help teachers understand and shift that focus towards innovation, push towards that right hand of the continuum, but also look at frameworks that go beyond technology and are frameworks around learning and innovation. And a great example I'll give you is Minnetonka Schools, who have put together this really interesting framework for instruction. And this was really their response to kind of breaking outside the box and the mold and really looking at what does it mean to have authentic real-world learning experiences? What does it mean to think critically? What does it really mean to work with students on, collaboration and creativity? And so many of us have seen these different frameworks and encouraging components around the 4 C's, but they did such a nice job blending this and giving stages and phases for teachers to understand how to push towards that right-hand side and how to innovate in the classroom in a way that's focused on the learning, not focused on the stuff. So I think they did a really great job with that. It's certainly something you can download off their site if you're interested in looking at that, because I think it's a really great illustration of how to move beyond. And so as we think about needing to pivot to innovation, one of the things that was important to us to really bake into our solution is to be able to help people think through this question of what are some of the ways your staff and your students move towards an innovative mind shift? What are things that we can do to really help this conversation? Can we start to think about inviting students and staff to participate in PLCs? Are there other experiences where focus is really on interest, talent, problem solving? Really thinking through where students can step up and take on roles of leadership, thinking about revamping those PD processes, co-teaching and facilitating. And what we get really excited about is the opportunity to really hone in on that idea of pockets of innovation and how do we lead that to systemic organizational change. And one of the things that we've done is really look carefully in our section all around instruction and learning in the inventory. There's a whole section where we're focused on innovation and looking at the types of questions that give us insight into the level of innovation happening within the organization. And what's so great, if I think back to the slides where we're looking at slicing that information by stakeholder, looking at it by individual department, if I picture just looking at my slice of innovation and being able to filter it down to that level of, well, which of my stakeholders are scoring the highest? Which of my campuses? Which of my levels? Which of my departments? I can find and identify those pockets of success, and I can go to them to learn and understand and build. Because sometimes as a leader, I'm not even sure where all of my pockets of innovation are happening inside and across my district. And so this gives me just this cool pulse point to understand and go and learn and find and discover. So really exciting to see that kind of baked in and continue to have that opportunity to really learn and understand. And certainly just thinking about doing more with what you have. One of the things that really resonated with me when Michael was doing the introduction and talking about the sponsors for today, and thinking about how important it is to have a plan of obsolescence within a district when you think about devices, but how important it is to repair and care for and have a relationship with someone who can take that piece to ensure that minimal downtime, ensure that you're doing more with what you have, is a vendor like CPR. So really cool to see them as a co-sponsor today, and just a shout out for the great work they do in contributing to help organizations maximize from that device standpoint, from that budget standpoint, and certainly from a partner standpoint in order to really make sure that you're doing what you can to maximize. So this really leads me to some key kind of conclusion thoughts and points here. We've stepped through the 4 different buckets I talked about, really understanding, okay, what is it that I already have and where can I shift focus, priority, budget if necessary? And then now that I kind of understand that piece, let's put context to the story of the full organization, what's happening. And now that I have all the information, how do I analyze it and what do I do and how do I look at it? And now that I know all of this, good grief, how do we move from here into doing some innovation, maximizing and doing more with less? Because I've just learned about how much stuff there is. So some of the things that are key points to keep in mind is, please don't forget initiative fatigue is real. This is one of the most difficult conversations that we have with districts when we sit down, and oftentimes as we're interviewing teachers or talking with key staff members and really understanding the type of stress and emotion that comes with this issue of initiative fatigue, and really making sure to be cognizant of how many initiatives you bring forward. It doesn't mean don't innovate. It doesn't mean stop doing new things. What it really means is let's figure out and get our arms around what's already happening before we jump onto something else. This whole idea of We've all experienced the barrage of new initiative, but they fizzle fast and the fatigue comes with it, and teachers begin to lose interest and you begin to lose buy-in across the organization because they literally just wait for the next thing. They're not going to grab on to the new thing that you've just rolled out or communicated or done a PD short shot on, because they know next week, next month, next year, it's going to be something different. There's no reason to jump on the train because the train changes every hour. So the advice to leaders as you're thinking about this, consider slowing down, limiting initiatives for really greater organizational clarity and greater organizational focus, because this is a very real issue that people face, and there's a disconnect that happens because the vision isn't well understood by those on the front lines who are just getting barraged with new implementations when the dots aren't connected to how they relate to what's happening in the organization. A cycle of new and more doesn't allow for that time to monitor, reflect, and adjust. We know as educators that it takes time to understand the impact that a new adoption, new implementation has. We know that we have to look back and analyze and understand and pivot and adjust, just like we do standing in a classroom giving a lesson. We do the same thing in the organization when we're doing these type of implementations, that we need an opportunity to pivot and adjust if necessary, and we need time to understand what's working and what's not. And oftentimes we're missing that step with the pace at which we're pushing out new initiatives and new things without stopping, connecting the dots, and reflecting with the organization on what's working and what's not. So just another great way to look at that type of a opportunity to analyze what's happening by inventorying your stakeholders and getting some pulse points on that and understanding how your initiatives are being impacted. So really think about making space. Limit some of the initiatives really for just a leaner organizational focus. Here are the 2 things we're focusing on this year, the 3 things we're focusing on this year, and ensuring that people understand and that kind of lean view on it is really what we see as high likelihood of positively impacting student outcomes, because you're actually able to focus your attention as an organization on these particular pieces. So my hope is that this has been helpful in thinking through the ways in which this is a great time of year to pause and reflect and think about, how do I audit my existing software and subscription that's happening? If we've just done more and haven't taken anything off the plate, let's make sure that we're using what we have, that we feel like what we have is making an impact. And then let's seek out the voices of our stakeholders. Let's actually baseline our organization, get an understanding of what's happening today. And once I have all that information and I get my analysis that I can look at all of this, now I can prioritize. Where do I focus? Is my struggle in an area that I need to go to the right? Is my struggle in an area to go left? And this allows me to tag on everything I'm doing with my focus, my planning, my PD. I can prioritize based on data and what my organization is telling me that it needs during this health check. And do more with what you have. So innovate with what you've already got. Innovate doesn't have to mean buying something new, implementing something new. Think about the ways in which you can move to the right-hand side of those continuums and frameworks that we talked about. What are things you can do to really promote innovation? And how do you identify your pockets of innovation to really get at that systemic implementation and in really great way of pushing that throughout the district? And make long-time initiative commitments. Please don't expect to have your commitments short-lived and expect to learn from them. This is where we're seeing those long-time commitments give us the opportunity to measure along the way, pivot and adjust as we need, and then really understand the actual impact on the learner. So this is a very hefty agenda in terms of things to think about, but what I hope is that it's interesting to stop and pause and think about all of the things you can collect in order to do that well check and really get that pulse point for moving forward in a way that impacts students. So I want to make sure to pause there to really answer any questions, take an opportunity, of course, to thank everyone for participating and hearing from our corner of the world the work that we're doing with school districts every day that really aligns great with this whole idea of looking back to get ahead. So thank you for your time, and I will open it up for questions at this point.
Julie, there was a couple of questions in the chat box. Looks like we've got an echo going on. I think if you turn off your microphone, Julie, real quick while I ask the question, then it'll stop the echo. So one of the questions was, is any of the inventory about hardware or devices?
Great question, and sorry about the microphone. I think we got it figured out here. So the inventory is really going to look at hardware and devices just in the components that are tied to resources, because hardware is one of our resources. Do students actually have access to devices? Does staff have access to the tools they need to do their job? And then the hardware in general is going to be touched all throughout that technology infrastructure section when we're really looking at the infrastructure, which is that lifeline of the tech component of the system. So yes, that's included as one piece of a much larger puzzle about the ecosystem of that EdTech organization.
Great. Another question. All of this looks like a ton of great data. How much time does it take for for an administrator to digest all of that?
I love that question. So this is why we developed Filtered, because we've been doing this work for so many years with districts, and we've been providing this information to them as the outcome of coming in and having these conversations, but we've been providing it to them in written reports, in full data dumps of all of the inventory information. And we developed Filtered as the opportunity to present it through a dashboard that does the work for you before you get to it. So when I log in as an administrator, I'm presented with the data that's already broken into all of these sections, already analyzed. It already calls out for me my bright spots, my opportunities for growth, and it begins me on a path towards 6 areas to look at based on my 6 focus areas of need and steps and recommendations. Now I can have all of the other information I want to look at and slice through and spend time on, but the system is presenting to you where your initial areas of focus and understanding are. So you don't have to be a data wonk to understand it. You don't have to open an Excel file and go sorting through information. You can view it in your graphs. You can see it on your chart. You can drill down by your campus, do a quick click and a share with anybody else that you want to have the information for.
Great. I think one more question. In the beginning, you talked about, doing an inventory of the subscriptions. And is this something that that vendors at a school or district will understand?
So one would certainly hope that anybody you're working with that provides a tool that students are learning and using, that it's something they need to be able to report on what's happening. And vendors really want to be good partners and good providers. And so my advice to you, having been on both sides of the fence, is to reach out to those vendors and let them know that you want to be a partner in this and you want to understand how their solution is impacting your organization. And if they can't help you find that type of data and get the information you're looking for, you really have to think about, how do we know that this tool is being useful to us if we can't understand who's using it, when it's being used, and what the situations are for it. So it should be a conversation a vendor should expect. I would absolutely expect someone to ask me that information and would be able to provide it to them. Certainly, you'll draw your own conclusions around the information when you get it, but something just as simple as being able to look at the data in terms of usage statistics, if it's a system that's also collecting any type of how students are progressing through, all of that is information your vendor should expect you to want to know about and want to get access to.
Great. I think that was the last of the questions. Thanks again for providing this professional development and overview this afternoon. And we look forward to anyone who has any questions to feel free to tweet at GrayEd Solutions any questions, and Julie will see those questions, or you can email her at info@grayed.com. Also, thanks to CPR for their support of this webinar, and we look forward to another webinar soon in the spring, and thanks again.